When some of us look at a map of the world or at the borders of a country, it might sometimes be easy to imagine a generally uniform culture from town to town, county to county, and region to region, but that's not typically the case. For big enough countries, it can become pretty easy for geographically separated areas to develop distinct and sometimes diverging variants of the dominant culture. This is even the case for relatively small countries who might have had a history of regional rivalries or who might have incorporated groups with different cultures into their modern borders through conquest or other means. Take the ancestrally French province of Quebec, for example. Some might wonder how this land and people wound up as a part of the largely Anglo-American country of Canada, making it an essential nation within a nation, and it's certainly not the only case in North America, let alone the world. Now in Quebec's case, I'm sure most of us are familiar with its history, but just to get everybody else up to speed, before Canada became a proper British colony, the entire western portion of the modern country comprising what would become the provinces of Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and of course Quebec, were colonies of the French Kingdom, and it held them for over a century and a half before ultimately losing Canada to Britain in the 7 Years' War. Now France wasn't as successful in settling its colonies as Britain had been. In fact, it often neglected its overseas possessions in favor of those in Europe, where it saw potential to become a dominant continental power. As far as it was concerned, overseas colonies were resource hubs meant to enrich the mainland, and settlement was really just a consequence of that. This wasn't the case for Britain, or rather England at the time, as it was physically removed from the continent and had become increasingly disinterested in continental disputes, not having easy access to territorial expansions like France had. Instead, Britain built its navy and sought out land elsewhere. Despite lower overseas ambitions, the French did manage to settle a good deal of their own people in Canada before it was won by England. For the sake of preventing rebellion, Britain provided the French Canadians special rights to retain their distinct language, culture, religion, and even their laws. For a time it was even considered by a few locals that Canada would remain largely French. However, when the American War for Independence came to an end, several pro-British colonists fled north of Canada, giving the Anglo-American population a large boost, leading to the establishment of new borders which facilitated wider Anglo-American settlement of Canada, while the French Canadians were sequestered away in their own protected province. To this day, the Quebecois remain a large and distinct cultural group within Canada whose history has become tied to the dominant culture, but who have regularly expressed desires to pursue a future of their own. Sticking with the theme of France's influence in America, our next nation within a nation is the Cajuns of southern Louisiana. Aside from Canada, the French also made claim to the Greater Louisiana Territory, taking up much of what would become the central United States. Like Canada, however, they did not settle very much of this territory, primarily concentrating on the southern coast, where they might establish a valuable port with access to the Mississippi River. Like the Anglo-Americans who fled the United States and gave greater number to those in Canada, the Franco-Americans of Louisiana saw their own population reinforced by French refugees from the colony of Acadia in the northeast, which had also been lost to England. Though having made fewer direct efforts to preserve their distinct culture, the Cajuns for most of their history passively influenced the larger culture of southern Louisiana to give it a unique character, which in turn reinforced their traditions over the years. Now that said, this group does appear to be shrinking on account of migration of the Cajuns to other states, greater assimilation into the broader American culture, and immigration to the state from other countries. Before going any further, let's take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Ridge Wallet! That's right, Ridge Wallet is back for the spring. It's time to swap out that old and faded leather wallet you're probably carrying around for something slimmer, more durable, and more secure. I love my Ridge wallets. They take up half the space my old wallet did, they look as good as the day they came out of the box, and thanks to their RFID blocking design, they keep my cards safe from pickpockets and the government. Whether you're looking for something simple or something flashy, Ridge has exactly what you need. Head over to ridge.com/MonsieurZ and use promo code MonsieurZ at checkout for a special discount. As always, Ridge offers free worldwide shipping and returns, and every single wallet is backed by a lifetime guarantee. Now, back to the video. Now that we've covered two examples of displaced French populations, let's turn to France itself, where we find another nation who for most of their history had not considered themselves French at all. I am referring to the peninsula of Brittany and the Celtic people who inhabit it. Long ago, much of Western Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to modern-day Hungary was largely occupied by various Celtic tribes. These tribes, however, were overwhelmed by the expanding Roman Empire and later by the Germanic tribes upon Rome's decline. Through all of that, this peninsula had held out and held on to its Celtic identity, later seeing additional waves of fleeing Celtic refugees from Britain when the island itself was falling under the control of the Germanic Anglo-Saxons. This blend of British and Old Gallic Celts eventually led to the emergence of Breton culture as its own unique Celtic identity. The peninsula would remain an independent entity for centuries before ultimately seeing integration into the French kingdom during its consolidation of neighboring territories, especially those which might prove sympathetic to rival England as they feared the Bretons might have been. Some have called Brittany the last vestige of the once widespread Celtic culture which dominated ancient Gaul, even despite the large and likely greater role British Celts played in shaping the region during the later centuries. But despite efforts to preserve their distinctiveness throughout much of their history, such efforts appear to be declining in the modern day as the region and its population have become increasingly integrated into the larger French culture. Directly neighboring France we find our next nation within the northern lands of Italy. Italy for much of its modern history has existed as a series of divided states, this including the long-standing Papal States which occupied the center of the Italian peninsula, dividing it along northern and southern lines. These regions already being variants of old Roman culture influenced by the Greeks in the south and both the Gauls and the Lombards in the north, would diverge further as the northern lands came to adopt aspects of Alpine and German culture on account of their proximity to the Alps and incorporation into the largely German Holy Roman Empire, while the south would see occupation by the Muslims of North Africa, followed by the Normans and later Spain. And though the Papal States became a literal middle ground for the populations of the north and south, their historic division slowed what might have otherwise been a more uniform mixture of the two cultures. The recognition of northern Italy as a distinct entity within the Italian Republic has led many to propose it receive either greater autonomy or total independence. Across the Mediterranean in the lands of North Africa we find another nation, this one spread across not one but several countries. This nation being the Berbers, long inhabitants of North Africa perhaps best known to the ancient world as the Numidians. They would later be displaced and arguably subjugated by the Islamic conquest of North Africa, establishing a new hierarchy in which Islamic Arabs stood at the top, Islamic Berbers below them, and non-Islamic Berbers at the very bottom. The Berbers would eventually stage a revolt in the west and hold onto the territories of North Africa from Morocco to Libya for a few more centuries, before being conquered by the Ottoman Empire and later the European powers. Today North Africa carries a dominantly Arab culture, however much of this population carries a significant quantity of Berber ancestry, and many argue that the population of North Africa is not in fact Arab but Arabized Berbers, something seemingly denied or resisted by the North African governments who appear intent on further Arabization. This has led a large number of Berbers who retain their historic culture and language to seek greater representation, autonomy, and even total sovereignty as their own state within southern Algeria or northern Mali. At the opposite end of the continent we find our second to last nation within a nation for this video, the Afrikaners. Originating from early Dutch settlers in the old Cape Colony, this population was fundamental to the eventual establishment of South Africa. Now there is some complexity to the history of the Afrikaner name, as it has been used to refer to any speakers of the Afrikaans language, one which evolved from Dutch over the centuries and which today has several millions of speakers. It has also been used to specifically refer to South Africans largely of Dutch ancestry, but generally those of broad European ancestry as well, as the Cape Colony would later see immigration from other sources. There's also a slight distinction to be made between the Afrikaners and a group known as the Boers, the latter being a historically agricultural population of Dutch Afrikaners and belonging to the larger group, though the terms are often confused. Boer has also been broadly used to distinguish European descendant Afrikaners from the majority mixed-race Afrikaans-speaking population. When the colony was acquired by Britain, a significant number of the agrarian Boer population migrated westward in hope of re-establishing their own independent republics, which they did, only to be forcibly annexed by Britain sometime later, seeing integration into the largely independent Union of South Africa, which would see power return to the hands of the Afrikaners, lasting up until the end of the apartheid era. Today the Afrikaner population has fallen to about half of what it was a century ago, and being a relatively small white population in a majority black country, with a history of tension between the two groups, the Afrikaners often find themselves victim to prejudice and oppression by the larger population. Finally, we come upon what is officially known as the Autonomous Region of Tibet in the southwestern lands of China. Tibet had historically been a major center of the Buddhist faith and the ancient home of the Tibetan people. Its harsh, mountainous geography served to protect the region from its powerful neighbors of China to the east, India to the south, and occasionally Persia to the west, allowing it to remain largely independent for much of its history, briefly falling under Mongol rule which contributed to the development of their particular variant of Buddhism, and centuries later falling under the control of the Qing dynasty in around 1700. It would remain under Chinese Manchurian control until the dynasty's collapse in early 1900, seeing reconquest by the Chinese some decades later after China had succumbed to communist control. Relations between Tibet and communist China are strained, with much debate over the nature of Tibet's supposed autonomy. Several claims have been made of Chinese suppression and destruction of Tibetan culture, from the demolition of monasteries to government kidnappings, and even propagandizing in the region to discourage religious adherence and identification with Tibetan culture. However, much of this is obscured by China, and the extent of these actions are difficult to confirm. For now, we'll wrap things up there. We had a few other groups we considered covering, but those will just have to wait for if and when we decide to do this again. Let us know if you have a nation within a nation you'd like to see us cover in the future. As always, the US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.